Hey everybody, Tony D and Little Joan here with a hot take. Lots of hot takes today. First up, this one's about Joe Biden and a statement he made. I guess it was like a couple of days ago. So he was doing one of his online talks. This one actually didn't go too badly. Didn't have one of the major gaffes he's known for. But he was talking to some kind of Islamic scholar, and he made a statement that was very strange for a Democrat to make. And that was something like, I'm paraphrasing, I wish we taught more about Islamic traditions in the schools. Now, the reason I say that's strange because, back in the 80s, Democrats were very much about church and state. Separation of church and state, baby. They were all about it. Now, one of the reasons they were all about it is, of course, it was a reaction to the Republicans, who were very religious. And they had the Christian coalition on their side. And so the Democrats would say, hey, separation of church and state. And I found it very interesting that kind of just sort of disappeared. And Joe Biden was in that era. So he was very much a part of that. So it's interesting that you have a presidential candidate for the Democratic Party actually saying, hey, I wish we talk more about religion in schools, but a particular religion. Now, first understand that the freedom of religion and the separation of church and state is really about what the founders didn't want is they didn't want the country to pick a state religion. That's what it's really about. There is no state religion in America. Now, a lot of people were Christian or Protestant. Obviously, it was mostly Protestant and Christians for a very long time, still is. But now we have a lot of other religions too, and there's nothing wrong with that. The issue legally over the years became, well, if you're going to have the Ten Commandments at the courthouse, well then we got to have, the Satanists sued some courthouse so they could have like a statue of Bahamut. Is that the demon's name or something? At the same courthouse. And then, of course, you got people who sue over the Christmas decorations in your town hall, and they demand, okay, no, it's got to be a generic holiday, or you got to include everybody from every religion, or else everybody feels left out and they get mad. That's what it's sort of turned into. So the interesting thing about this is I keep saying that this election is mirroring what happened in the UK. And what happened in the UK to the labor movement, which is sort of their Democrats, is they went woke big time. Identity politics, huge. Outright communists and socialists, like we're now beginning to see in at least in Portland and Seattle. And these people were absolutely convinced, just like over there. Now, over there, instead of having Trump, they had Brexit. Brexit was their Trump. I mean, they have Boris Johnson, who's now the prime minister, but he's not Trump. He is he would be the equivalent of like a Mark Rubio type Republican for us. Just a normal Tory for the most part. Slightly a little more amped up, but not really. But the issue over there with Brexit was all about immigration. And they have a tremendous amount of immigration coming from Muslim countries like Syria, like Iraq, because remember, all the Iraqis fled to Syria. And then, well, they fled to a lot of places, but Syria was one of them. And when Syria went to hell, now you got the Iraqi refugees there and the Syrians fleeing. So you had hundreds of thousands of people pouring into the Soviet Union. European Union. They were pouring into the European Union, and the countries there, it's different. We have more space in the United States. Our immigrants come here, they integrate better, and even when they don't, there's so much room, it kind of doesn't matter. So you end up with situations like Ilhan Omar's district, right? There's a lot of Somalis there, and that's why she got elected. It's a very Somali district. But you're not going to see half the House of Representatives turn Somali because there's not enough Somalis here. I mean, you just couldn't get that many core groups of Somalis. Even if you imported the entire country of Somalia, there wouldn't be that many. Maybe you could take over a state. But it was different in Europe. It's too compact. So you had hundreds of thousands of immigrants coming into these much smaller communities and smaller countries, and they weren't integrating. And over time, there's more and more and more. And that was a real problem. So you ended up with Brexit, and the UK left, and it split the country like Trump split us, right? So you had people in the media, they were anti-Brexit. No, we had to stay in the European Union. And the media there did everything to trash people who were Brexiters. They called them racist. They called them, sound familiar? They said they were a bunch of boobs who didn't understand anything. And they had to vote for Labour because otherwise they were a bunch of bigots and homophobes and transphobes. And it went on and on and on. And guess what? A lot of people were sick of it. They were sick to the back teeth of being called racist and homophobe and transphobe because they weren't, and Islamophobe. They weren't. And meanwhile, the Labour Party and the members of the Labour Party got more and more woke, and they bought their own hype, and they bought the hype of the media that was basically in their pocket, basically on their side from beginning to end. And just like here, their media was so biased in one direction, they thought they were winning. And they had an election, and guess what? They got trashed. Okay? So their equivalent of the southern states would be the northern provinces, I think they're called. Provinces, districts of the UK. And they all flipped for the Tories, basically, except for Scotland. Scotland went really woke, by the way. And the Labour Party was devastated. They lost seats they held for almost a century. A century. So imagine your state or district has been Democrat for almost 100 years, and then it turns Republican. That's what it would have been like for some of these people. I swear to God, Joan, if you ruin this take. That's the way it is. And that's the way it is here now. Joan, stop. And so the reason I made this comment, and I thought this thing with Biden was so interesting, because what happened over there too was you had a merger of the intersectional feminists and a lot of the Islamicists. Not your average Muslim. I'm talking people who are more fanatic about Islam. And they kind of came together because the intersectional feminists were so obsessed with their virtue signaling, they blindly supported all immigrants regardless of what they did. And in any group of people, whether they're immigrants, whether they're just a random group of 100 people, there's always a problem. There's always a problem with some people. Not everybody is good. They're human beings just like us. The problem in the UK was nobody would acknowledge that for the immigrants. They became a protected class, and so the problems that were small, just normal sort of criminal problems, ballooned out of control. And that's how they got their grooming gang scandal. Google that when you want to go down a rabbit hole. It's awful. Anyhow, here we've got a similar thing happening. Just like in the UK with the Labour Party, they had problems with anti-Semitism. Here, we're having the same problem on the left. More anti-Semitism, more racism from the extremists. Now we've got the statement from Joe Biden. It is indicative of what happened to the Labour Party. They're so strident in terms of their virtue signaling. They are trying to include everybody, just sort of blindly. Meanwhile, again, this is just things that happen. We've got problems against Christians here, right? We've had attacks on churches, attacks on Virgin Mary statues and Jesus. And it's not that the churches here need some sort of special protection, but they need protection just like everywhere else. And they're not getting the equal protection because we have this situation in which the left side of politics wants to virtue signal so badly certain groups get more protection rather than just everybody getting the protection. And certain groups, well, it's okay to criticize them and say nasty things about them on Twitter. But other groups, oh no, you're going to get banned from Twitter and you're going to get banned from the news, and you're going to be called all sorts of nasty names. So it's interesting to me that Biden said this, but he didn't give it any context. He didn't say, well, I think everybody should learn about all the major religions in school. They probably should. Not that they would teach religion in schools, but religion is a part of history. So no one's suggesting that, yes, we should be teaching religion, but we should teach about these religions in their historical context. Because obviously, the Catholic Church plays a huge part in Western civilization. And for America, it's not just the Catholic Church, it's also the Protestants, because they basically founded America. The Muslims, sure, they played a role too, as did the Jewish people, as did Buddhist and Shintoism and the whole 9 yards of religion. Children should learn sort of the basics that they exist, but, there's a limit there, because we don't want to get in a situation in which teachers are teaching a particular religion or that this is the right religion. They have to teach it in context, because we do have a separation of church and state. And again, there's nothing wrong with teaching things about religion, but you can't just pick one over another. Government, especially America, you're not supposed to pick the winners and losers. So to virtue signal, to have a curriculum that's just a bunch of virtue signaling, just so, see how wonderful and woke we are? We're teaching about Islam. You can't just teach about Islam. You have to teach about all the religions, even weird ones. That only a few people belong to, that maybe nobody likes, like made up ones that people don't really subscribe to. I'm not a religious guy myself, but I think there's some value in at least teaching they exist. But Biden is just virtue signaling, and I think he's pandering to a base. And for him to do that, man, that's just not going to end well. It's not going to end well, because he's only talking about one religion. And in the UK, they overcompensated to the point where Muslim suspects from the police were treated with kid gloves, whereas anybody else wasn't. They had a situation in which they were so anxious to get Muslim communities into their schools, but then the Muslims, some of them who weren't as woke, suddenly had a problem with gay teachers teaching certain things in the UK schools. So their wokeness kind of backfired on them, and they didn't know what to do. This is what happens when you go down the path of wokeness and you don't just sort of stick with the basic principles of freedom, liberty, learning everything, knowing everything. The problem with that, well, now you've got a bunch of religious people who you've sort of catered to all this time and told them they could do whatever they want. And you told them that, well, if anybody gives you any flack, well, they're an Islamophobe. Now the UK has a huge problem with that. Well, it's not a huge problem, but it's a problem. The Democratic Party could easily go that way, except for the fact that we don't have the massive influx of Muslim immigrants here, and we have the room, so even if we did, they'd just spread out all over the country and it really wouldn't matter. But you could see that if we were, say, closer to 9/11, you remember when George W. Bush immediately came out and said, don't blame the Muslims. It's like, well, no one's blaming the Muslims as a whole, but you can't just put on blinders and say the religion had nothing to do with September 11th. That was an element in the world events. That was an element in the hijackers' mental state. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't even have done it. So I'm saying we need a balanced sort of approach to that. And Biden just sounds like he's pandering. And he's tiptoeing very close to where the Labor Party went. And quite frankly, I think he's already over that line. The whole Democratic Party is. And we're going to see just an absolute trashing of the Democrats this time around. I'm still calling it red tidal wave in November.